Hello, I'm Sophia, and welcome to What We Need to Know About Ukraine. Here, I learn about Ukrainian history, literature, and culture, and share my findings with you. Today's episode is about Mykola Gogol, a Ukrainian who turned out to be one of the greatest and most influential writers of all time. He had a huge influence worldwide, and especially on Ukrainian literature and culture. His writing consists of one novel, a few novellas, many shorter stories, a few plays, and of course, many letters, notes, etc. He inspired many authors and people in general. For example, Ukrainian composer Mykola Lysenkos wrote multiple operas based on his works, and fragments of those you will hear throughout the episode. But how did Gogol come to dominate the literary scene? Why is he considered a genius? And who was he really? Let us start with his childhood, his interests and inspirations. Mykola Gogol was born in 1809 in a village called Sorochinci in Poltavska Oblast, Ukraine. Poltavska Oblast was then under the control of the Russian Empire. Gogol's passion for Ukrainian culture dates back to his childhood. Gogol was born into a Cossack family. His grandmother shared a lot of Ukrainian folk tales and fairy tales with him. Meanwhile, the writer's mother knew many folk songs and loved to sing them. Communicating with the people living in the villages revealed to Mykola a lot of wise folk sayings, proverbs, and witty jokes, as well as the unique beauty of the rituals of his native land. Over the years, the love for Ukraine and its culture and history became stronger and more conscious. When he was 9 and 10, he studied in a school in Poltava, and from the age of 12 until he was 19, which is 7 years, he studied at the Nizhin Gymnasium. Nizhin is a city that is not far from Kyiv, and at the gymnasium, which is a school, he studied Ukrainian history and folk customs, as well as oral folk stories, and of course, maths, etc. He also directed and acted in plays, and was known to be a very good actor, and a talented one. While studying at the Nizhin Gymnasium, Gogol constantly visited different villages. He was fascinated by various myths and legends, especially scary stories about evil spirits, songs and rituals, which he sometimes had to be a part of. After graduating from the gymnasium, Mykola Gogol toured almost the entire Poltavska Oblast. Probably during his youth, Gogol came to realize that it is the ordinary people who are the bearers of folk creativity, traditions, and customs. The wise treasurer, the guardian of all antiquity, which directly attests to the existence of the Ukrainian nation with its unique language, history, and culture. Since 1826, Mykola began to keep a notebook called Book of All Sorts of Things, or a handy encyclopedia, where he wrote down information that was interesting to him and related to various spheres of life. It was compiled over several years and based on various sources. It actually had a sort of encyclopedic character, and it practically exhausts the circle of works of Ukrainian literature known at that time. A large part of the records are materials related to Ukraine in one way or another, which were later used by the writer in the stories included in the collections Evenings on a Farm Near Dykhanka and Myrhorod. There are several sections of the entries in the Book of All Sorts of Things, or a handy encyclopedia. The first one is called Ukraine Separate Notes, and it contains information about the Holy Trinity, Ivana Kupala, Obzhinki, also related songs, rites, beliefs, plant symbols. Some moments of the wedding ceremonies and wedding songs are also described there. It is also impossible not to note and pay attention to the record of a folk belief that, quote, witches remove and hide stars, end quote, which was directly reflected in the story Night Before Christmas. The second section was Customs of Ukraine, and it was quite small and consisted of a matchmaker's speech, wishes to the newlyweds, and a description of caroling. The third section was part of a letter received from his mother in 1829, and it is entirely devoted to the description of wedding ceremonies and their participants, like friends, in-laws, boyars, etc., as well as several more wedding songs. The writer used this material in the story of St. John's Eve. Separately, there was a section titled Proverbs, Sayings, and Phrases of Ukraine, which is an exact, with the exception of the last 5 proverbs, copy of the Grammar of Ukrainian Idiom. By the way, Gogol loved to listen and sing Ukrainian folk songs, and he knew many of them by heart. He himself recorded about 1,000 songs, actually more than 1,000 songs, which today are kept in archives, and even helped his friend, the first head of Kyiv University of St. Volodymyr, now named after Shevchenko, to publish a collection of Ukrainian folk songs. And perhaps he is the reason why they still survive today. In the Petersburg Notes, Gogol writes, quote, "Show me a nation that would have more songs. Our Ukraine rings with songs." In the stories, Evenings on a Farm Near Dykanka, the reader is exposed to a whole flavor of Ukrainian national life, the way of life, rites, and customs. Fiction is a mandatory element of these stories, and sometimes giving them a special element of magic and mystery, sometimes turning them into a comic grotesque. The goal of Mykola Gogol's work is to revive the soul, to stir up the heat in people's souls which is beginning to fade. And this is achieved not by reason or will, but by senses, emotions, which are able to translate deeply and vividly to life. And precisely that art which preserves the heart sense becomes valuable, like poetry, songs, music, and dance. Gogol depicted Ukrainian folk images in all the complexity and diversity of their thoughts and feelings. Turning to fiction was not the result of interest in ethnographic materials, the brightness and diversity of Ukrainian folklore, which really was there, but more of a means of penetrating the psychology of Ukrainians. The novel Evenings on a Farm Near Dykanka, or sooner the collection of stories, is really a treasure trove not only of social psychology, but also of Ukrainian ethnopsychology, as the author provides readers with an artistic understanding of the essential features of the Ukrainian mentality and Ukrainian national character. National, ethnographic, ethno-psychological properties are described by Gogol specifically using the examples of the lifestyle of Ukrainians. Birth and upbringing in Ukraine influenced the physical and moral formation of Gogol, of course. This was reflected in his artistic manner of adequately reflecting the ethno-psychological features of Ukrainians in his works. Ukrainian scholar Voropayeva claims that the landscape and climatic conditions that are presented in Gogol's work as a mental factor. In particular, Ukrainian night is a representation of folk romanticism, demonology, mysticism, and mystery itself. While the Ukrainian steppe is the personification of untouched space and freedom, the Ukrainian river, a representation of strength and freedom, the field, a personification of an ordered and equipped space and a generous harvest. The garden is fruitfulness, the sky, dreaminess, comedy, and holiness. Although Gogol wrote his works in Russian, but I'll talk about that more later, scientists estimate that more than 200 Ukrainian idioms are used in Evenings on a Farm Near Dykanka. In particular, the author uses Ukrainian names to describe clothing, most of which is unique to Ukraine, as well as footwear, food, musical instruments, and weapons. In his story that goes into this collection called The Terrible Vengeance, we have a rather detailed description of the interior of a Ukrainian house. All the stories of Evenings on a Farm Near Dykanka are based on motifs of Ukrainian folklore. In particular, in St. John's Eve, the story is based on the folk legends and tales about Ivan Kupala. In the Book of All Sorts of Things, or a handy encyclopedia, there is a note by Mykola Gogol which served as a source for the plot of the story. Fern blooms with a fiery flower only at midnight on St. John's Day, and whoever manages to pluck it will find a treasure. Mykola Gogol's story, May Night, is written on the basis of folklore records, which the author received from his mother and relatives. Thus, the novel begins based on the folk song, "The sun is low, the evening is near. Сонце низенько, вечір близенько." And the folk mythology is widely used in other chapters. Mykola Gogol's story, Terrible Revenge, with all its folklore and romantic character, indicates the writer's interest in the history of Ukraine, in the national liberation struggle of the Ukrainian people. In this work, historical events are intertwined with fairy tale and fantastic motifs. It is close to folk legends and historical ideas, contains many folklore images, similes, and epithets. The plot of Gogol's story, The Enchanted Place, originates from folklore stories about finding an enchanted treasure. The story is based on legends and fairy tales about the deceptive, that is, enchanted places. In folk tales, there are references to a candle that lights up, indicating the location of the treasure. In the same way, there are motifs of money and wealth provided by the devil and its transformation into garbage, just like in Ukrainian folklore. The writer depicts mystical and human evil according to the folk tradition, in the form of devils and other demonological beings and things. But it is helpless and even funny in this harmonious and sunny world. The works of Gogol can be considered not only as an encyclopedia of Ukrainian studies, but also as a treasury of Ukrainian ethnopsychology, because it was he who depicted the most essential features of the Ukrainian mentality and the Ukrainian national character. The writer showed the deep roots of Ukrainian national consciousness. Feelings of spiritual and psychological unity with Ukraine were reflected in the worldview of the writer. In 1847, Gogol wrote, quote, "My images will not be alive if I do not build them from their material, from our land, so that everyone will feel that it was taken from his own body. Only then will he wake up, and only then will he be able to become a different person. Here is the confession of my literary work." Reading Mykola Gogol, we notice that his characters personified some negative traits of human nature as well, which the author discovered in his own soul. The writer once jokingly said that he got rid of all of his flaws thanks to the fact that he passed them on to his characters. He talentedly knew how to put himself in the place of another person, play all possible manifestations of his behavior, that is, he could model the state of another person's psyche. Gogol's characters are also really well versed in folk mythology, familiar with life-giving folklore sources, legends, and tales. When writing the story Taras Bulba, Gogol not only used chronicles and scientific research on the history of Ukraine, but also folklore and historical thoughts and songs. It is interesting that the literary hero, the Cossack, Taras Bulba, is identified with the real historical figure of Bogdan Khmelnytsky's time, Ostap Gogol. It is known that Gogol aspired to become a historian, and he wanted to create a multi-volume history of Ukraine. Quote, "I now started working on the history of our one and only poor Ukraine. Nothing soothes me as much as history. My thoughts begin to flow more quietly and gracefully. I believe that I will write it, that I will say many things that have not been said before me." End of quote. When living in St. Petersburg, Gogol was offered the position of Professor of Russian History in Kyiv, instead of Ukrainian or general history position which he desired. He declined the offer, citing the lack of interest and experience. Upset, Gogol wrote to his friend that teaching Russian history would drive him insane. Quote, "Damn me, I would rather agree to take botany or pathology than Russian history." What the definitive dislike of Russian history and the absolute love of Ukrainian history can tell us is that Ukrainian and Russian histories were different, and Gogol wrote about these differences. Gogol has an article, an essay on historical issues called Reflections of Mazepa. In this literary and historical essay, Mykola writes as if he is Hetman Mazepa and says, quote, "There was such a nationality that was different from the Russian nationality. i.e. Ukrainian, and Gogol's Mazepa thought about this Ukrainian nationality and it not losing its independence. And of course, this was written by Gogol in 1835. There is yet another excerpt from Gogol's article, A View on the Formation of Ukraine. And he says, quote, "Two states were formed, which were called by the same name, Ruthenia, one under the Tatars, another under the same scepter with the Lithuanians. But there was no longer any communication between them. Different laws, different customs, different purpose, different connections, different exploits made for two completely different characters." End of quote. If one has read Gogol, one might notice that in his works about and set in Ukraine, the characters and even descriptions of nature are more romantic, lyrical, exciting. On the other hand, in works about Russia, they are more restrained and sometimes frankly hostile, since when writing about St. Petersburg, he wrote mainly satire. Mykola Gogol himself wrote about this, and he has a very good article about it, where he expresses his attitude to Russian and Ukrainian songs. In particular, he talks about Ukrainian songs, and that they are very lyrical, melodious, that they sing about a Cossack hero, about a knight who defends his land, that they are full of life. And Russian songs, on the contrary, are sad. They do not call for life. They do not glorify some folk hero, since they don't even have a folk hero at all. But why did Gogol write in Russian and not Ukrainian? Like I already said, Gogol was brought up in a family of Ukrainian nobles, and he was also brought up under difficult circumstances of a very difficult linguistic situation in Ukraine, which had already been fully politically integrated into the Russian Empire for quite some time, and where after the failed uprising of 1709, that is 100 years before Gogol's birth, against Russia under the leadership of Hetman Ivan Mazepa, that of course he wrote about as if he was Mazepa. And since then, any manifestations of independent Ukrainian cultural life were pushed out and destroyed. Despite this, Gogol's family still spoke Ukrainian. His father Vasil wrote Ukrainian plays, and his mother never mastered the foreign Moscow language. When Gogol was born in 1809, spoken Ukrainian already had low status in the part of Ukraine that was part of the Russian Empire. Many Ukrainian aristocrats who accepted Russian control considered the Ukrainian language only the language of the common, uneducated people, as the Russian propaganda actively spread this information. So, if a person rose to higher levels of society, he usually, unfortunately, stopped using Ukrainian. Russian became the written language in Ukraine after the decree of Peter I in 1720, according to which all books published in Ukraine had to be published in Russian. And you can learn more about prohibitions such as these in the episode called History of Ukrainian Language and the Attempts of Linguistic Genocide. And now let's get back. The low status of the spoken language meant that the earliest works in which it was used were burlesque and comedies, that is, stage productions for people in which the Ukrainian language was acceptable. Russians did not perceive Ukrainian literature because they were considering Ukrainian to be the language of uneducated Russians who simply come from a specific region of Russia. In other words, comedies written in Ukrainian were not perceived by Russians as separate literature, but as some peripheral works of Russian literature. Therefore, many Ukrainian authors at the time wrote in Russian, and this was quite normal. At the same time, Finland began developing its national literature and national ideas, even though that literature was written fully in the Swedish language. And it doesn't automatically make it Swedish, now does it? By the way, for almost a century and a half, there has been a legend that Gogol wrote his first works in Ukrainian and then he translated them into Russian, and that somewhere in the archives, it is probably still possible to come across the corresponding manuscripts. However, there is still no confirmation, and this is of course no surprise, since if these manuscripts do exist, Russia will take great care to keep them hidden. So, was Gogol Ukrainian? And I think most importantly, did he consider himself Ukrainian? The short answer is yes. In 1840, Mykola Gogol went to Czechia to a sanatorium where he signed in, and he signed in French as Mykola de Gogol, Ukrainian. This was not the only time he did so, and whenever he traveled in Europe, he mentioned his being Ukrainian. Speaking of Czechia, there were famous Czech authors that spoke of Gogol. The famous Czech poet and translator Jan Vladislav includes Mykola Gogol among Ukrainian writers who wrote in Russian. He says, quote, "Ukraine is not just a cultural appendage of Russia, but an independent cultural region that contributes great cultural values, including the work of those Ukrainians who wrote in Russian, for example, Gogol." Mykola Gogol was a world traveler. He was an immigrant everywhere in St. Petersburg and in Prague, Paris, and in Rome, which he loved and where he lived for more than 5 years. With special joy, of course, he visited Kyiv, which he really missed. In one of his letters to his close friend, a Ukrainian historian residing in Russia, he writes, "Indeed, leave Katsapia and go to the Hetmanate." Katsapia is the less pleasant term used to refer to Russian states. Meanwhile, Hetmanate is Ukraine with the emphasis on the Cossacks. I myself am thinking of doing the same and go there next year. We are fools if you think carefully. Why and for whom do we sacrifice everything? Let's go. End of quote. But unfortunately, it did not happen, and Mykola Gogol went to St. Petersburg. He said, quote, "Although the soul longs for Ukraine, it is necessary to submit." But Gogol did not like St. Petersburg. He described it as, quote, "inauthentic, mock-European, faux-modern city in which regalia and rank mask the underlying reality." End of quote. We can see the sentiment really clearly in his writings. Gogol constantly wanted to return home. To his Ukrainian friend living in Moscow, he wrote, quote, there, to Kyiv, to ancient, beautiful Kyiv. It's ours, it's not theirs, isn't it?" End of quote. Because even Gogol knew that Kyiv is Ukrainian, and always will be only Ukrainian. When Gogol came to St. Petersburg for the first time in 1829, for 2 or 3 years, he walked around with osoledets, or chub, on his head, which is a traditional haircut of the Cossacks. This was testified by multiple of Gogol's close acquaintances. On one hand, this is how he respected the traditions of his people, and on the other hand, it was like throwing a challenge to the Imperial Russian society, since he was clearly marking and positioning himself as a Ukrainian. Another interesting fact is when Gogol first came to Moscow, he was invited to the house of the famous artist Szczepkin, a fellow Ukrainian from Poltava that resided in Moscow and who gathered all of the artistic beau monde at his house. But they knew each other only through correspondence and had never met before. And this is what Szczepkin's son recorded in his memoirs. Quote, "An unknown person comes in, enters the room, looks around at all those presents, and sings. Ходить гарбуз по городу, питається свого роду, ой, чи живі, чи здорові, усі родичі гарбузові." And the English translation being, "A pumpkin walks around the garden, asking its kind, oh, are all the pumpkin's relatives alive and healthy?" That is, he sang a well-known traditional Ukrainian song, and when everyone were surprised, didn't know who he was, Szczepkin said, "And this is Mykola Vasilievich Gogol, who has come to us." If you analyze it, then again, on the one hand, it was a challenge, and on the other, so to speak, identifying yourself with the Ukrainians who were in Moscow at the time. And later, of course, Gogol and Szczepkin became friends. They often met and liked to talk about Ukraine, anything Ukrainian, and to sing songs. Both loved to eat Ukrainian dishes, and as eyewitnesses wrote, quote, "They constantly talked about borscht, vareniki, and some kind of palyaniцы." End of quote. This is another proof that Gogol was Ukrainian by conviction. He considered himself Ukrainian and he was proud of it. Not only that, but he told jokes, and for which he was scolded a lot in Moscow and St. Petersburg because these jokes were about stupid Muscovites. And Mykola put them into circulation. But on the other hand, there are records that he also told jokes about not-so-smart Ukrainians. In other words, Gogol always loved to laugh, and his contemporaries noted this. Of course, Gogol knew and spoke Ukrainian freely since so did his family. It was his first language, and after all, he referred to Russian as a foreign language. In a letter to his mom, he wrote that if his stories will get published, they will be in a foreign language. And of course, we know that language to be Russian. For Gogol, we established Russian was a foreign language, and so was Russia. Gogol also wrote to his father, quote, "I already see everything sweet to my heart. I see you, I see my sweet homeland. I see quiet Psel, shimmering through the light covers that I will throw off, enjoying real happiness, forgetting the regret that passed quickly." End of quote. Mykola Gogol was constantly told by his friends that he still needed to learn the Russian language because the language in which he wrote was noticeably different from the language in which, say, Pushkin or Turgenev wrote. Mykola Gogol's language, if analyzed according to syntax, clearly corresponded to the Ukrainian language, except that he wrote in Russian words, and as we established previously, he used many Ukrainian words as well. From this we can make out that Mykola Gogol's worldview and writing is Ukrainian. He speaks of that himself, of course. For him, it was the people who were the bearer of all the nation's spiritual values. Gogol wrote, quote, "True nationality is not in the description of a piece of clothing, but in the very spirit of the people. A poet can be national when he describes a completely foreign world, but he looks at it through the eyes of his national element, through the eyes of his people, when he feels and speaks in such a way that it seems to his compatriots that they feel and speak it themselves." End of quote. When turning to write about the Russian imperial world, the writer absolutely honestly showed it as he saw it from the Ukrainian point of view. Dark, despotic, cruel, dead-hearted. Of course, this was not a superficial, purely journalistic criticism of a specific social system. On the new material, the artist continued to search for eternal, divine harmony and the basis of existence, but he did not find it. He revealed the deepest secrets of the human soul, the basic, timeless mechanisms of evil. Gogol did not glorify the empire, but he told the terrible truth about it, challenged it, which is again a striking contradiction. And this outraged many Russians. Now, since Gogol speaks, writes, and sees through a Ukrainian perspective, should we not translate his works in the same way? Not only as Ukrainian literature instead of labeling his work as Russian, but also taking care to translate the Ukrainian essence put in everything in his work. There were definitely problems with translations of Gogol's works, and there still are. The fact that Gogol emerged as the greatest prose writer and therefore dramatist attracted and increased attention to his work, when, for one reason or another, it also increased interest in Russia and not Ukraine. And this grew in the rest of the world. General interest in Russia increased interest in its literature, and translators often chose Gogol's works to illustrate this Russian literature for whatever Russian state it would apply to. Moreover, the story Taras Bulba was very often translated, the action of which took place in Ukraine at a time when it was not even a part of the Russian Empire. And why is it so? Because, as it seemed to the translators, it was he, Gogol, who best illustrated the characteristic features of Russians and presented a quote-unquote special Russian soul. This, of course, turned out to be false. And since these translators came from cultures distant from Ukraine, when Ukraine was already part of the Russian Empire, they could not see that Taras Bulba and other Cossacks, both fictional and real, were not Russian. When the Cossacks used the word Ruthenian in the story, then the roots of this word should be thought in Ukraine Rus, or Ruthenia, and not in modern Russia. The greatest paradox of this is the myth of special Russian soul, which lives in certain Western circles to this day and in Russia as well. And this myth was born precisely thanks to Gogol, a Ukrainian, and in many ways thanks to his novella Taras Bulba. This soul, of course, was not Russian, but Ukrainian, and has nothing at all in common with Russia. Taras Bulba has been translated more than 15 times in the English-speaking world, and before the emergence of Ukraine as an independent state, only one 1962 translation of his work was from the Ukrainian point of view. And it was done in such a way that the reader could clearly understand that the Cossacks were fighting for Ukraine there, and that the action was taking place historically in Ukraine before it became part of the Russian Empire. In the most recent translations after the independence of Ukraine, the foundations for knowledge about Ukraine in the rest of the world appeared. Translations can no longer ignore the Ukrainian element that is key in Gogol's works, so the newer translations indicate the stories are about Ukrainian history, culture, and Ukrainian heroes. In general, it is important to note that Mykola Gogol opened a channel of information and knowledge about Ukraine and its culture to the rest of the world. As early as 1860, English readers could read about the heroism of Ukrainian Cossacks, about Ukrainian customs. And although many mistakenly perceived these works as Russian, and Gogol himself to be Russian, this does not change the fact that the writer was Ukrainian, wrote about Ukraine, and is one of the most famous Ukrainian writers, a classic of world literature, which Ukraine can certainly be proud of. Gogol died at the age of 42, and quite suddenly, 10 days after allegedly burning the second tome of his novel Dead Souls. He spent the last years of his life in Italy and other European countries, after not being extremely welcome into St. Petersburg and Moscow. When he goes back to finally print the second part of his novel, he burns it and dies having no previous illness. A coincidence? Perhaps, and perhaps his work did not make it through censorship of the empire. In any case, out of his 42 years of life, only 15 of them was spent in a Russian part of the Russian Empire. 19 was spent in Ukraine, of course not counting the visits, and 7 in other European countries. The bard, Taras Shevchenko, spent also around 15 years of his life in Russia. Shevchenko could see the cherry orchard of a house in Ukraine through the bars of the jail in Russia, and Gogol, gazing at the Russian river, saw the amazing Dnipro, so powerful in its width that, as Gogol said, not every bird can overcome even half of it. The romantic visions and hyperboles of these two geniuses are commensurate with the immense strength of their love for Ukraine. So, why was Gogol so famous? Why are his works so important? And why is he a true genius? Few people know that Gogol, whose native language was Ukrainian, gained a central place in Russian literature precisely because he was Ukrainian. He knew the Ukrainian culture of the time, which was almost completely unknown in Russia, and having translated it for the Russian reader, became extremely famous. Gogol was in the right place at the right time, with the right knowledge and desire to succeed. He was also helped by the fact that under difficult political circumstances in the Russian Empire, he knew how to ideologically adapt his texts to a specific political situation, and that was that Ukraine was being controlled by the Russian Empire. Gogol's works display different variations of the Romantic style and a masterly use of metaphor, hyperbole, and ironic grotesque. His language is exceptionally rhythmic and euphoric. He employed a host of lexical and synthetic Ukrainianisms. Some of his Ukrainian stories are the examples of the naturalist school. Gogol's writings were frequently imitated by such Ukrainian writers as Grigory Kvitka-Osnovyanenko and Panteleimon Kulish. Echoes of Gogol can be felt in the work of Dovzhenko, who is an amazing Ukrainian film director. Gogol is present in the works of Mykola Gogol, Yuri Yanovsky, and even Ostap Vyshnya. His character, Taras Bulba, defined a lot of Ukrainian cultural consciousness. Gogol, of course, wrote in Russian, but he wrote with a distinct Ukrainian accent. He was Ukrainian, and he is still part of the Ukrainian heritage and Ukraine's national and cultural essence. And yet, this Ukrainian overturned Russian literature, and in many ways as well, precisely because he was Ukrainian, because he was so different in it. Gogol basically kick-started Russian literature, and his influence can be felt in the likes of Ivan Turgenev and Dostoevsky. Without Gogol, there would be no Kafka or South American magical realism literature like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Mykola Gogol truly influenced the world. Gogol has left an important imprint on both the literary and the philosophical realm. So important is his influence that even today, writers are trying to bridge romanticism and realism, surrealism and naturalism in Gogolian ways. Gogol's writing style is entirely his own, and in all of his writings, whether they be of madness or lucidity, the ridiculousness of Russian aristocracy, or the paradoxes of modernity, Gogol has been able to merge the empirical and supernatural into one. The majority of today's stories have taken their shape from Gogol's writing. The stories which are considered today to be Kafkaesque, absurdist, or magical realism follow directly in Gogol's footsteps. His literary work still depicts some of the greatest social criticisms in literary form. The genius of Mykola Gogol is also that with him a new stage of Ukrainian national literature begins. And to a certain extent, the Ukrainian national idea begins in a fairly modern form. At the same time, this Ukrainian writer, beginning somewhere in the St. Petersburg novels that he wrote, did not just lead Russian literature, but he created a new version of Russian literature, which surprisingly combined harsh realism and elements of what would later be called surrealism and the avant-garde. In addition, Gogol created a new version of Ukrainian and Russian drama, starting with his play The Government Inspector. And this applies not only to Ukrainian and Russian literature, but also to the entire world of drama. Ukrainian author Oksana Zabushko believes that it was Gogol who had a unique role to be the last of the powerful Ukrainian Baroque culture of the 17th and 18th centuries. However, when Gogol took the Ukrainian Baroque to Moscow and St. Petersburg, at a time when Russian Romanticism was looking for inspiration and exoticism, the Russian literary system absorbed Gogol's Baroque stories and was enriched by them. Czech writers were also interested in and highly valued the work of Mykola Gogol. A famous Czech poet, journalist, and politician, Karel Havlicek-Borovsky, ranked Gogol's work really high. In a 1843 letter to the writer and historian Karl Vladislav Zapp, who was the first translator of Gogol's works into Czech, he noted in a particular quote, "To this day, I only know Gogol. All the others, including Pushkin, are, so to speak, immeasurable pecus." End of quote. Immeasurable pecus from Latin means flattering imitators. By the way, in the letter, Borovsky wrote Gogol's last names using the letters H instead of G, which is closer to the Ukrainian pronunciation of Gogol's last name. American classic author Ernest Hemingway called Gogol's novella Taras Bulba as, quote, one of the 10 greatest books of all time. Meanwhile, Gabriel Garcia Marquez referred to Gogol in his Nobel Prize speech and said that all new Latin American prose emerged from Gogol's mysticism. Think of Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. But probably most important is what Mykola Gogol did for Ukraine. The creativity of this writer has a distinct Ukrainian mental character, the main features of which are optimism, the priority of the heart over head, and poetic worldview. Gogol strengthened Ukrainian literature and led to greater interest in Ukrainian literature and Ukraine itself from those abroad. He also created a bridge for Ukrainians that did not feel a strong national identity under Moscow's pressure to come back to the Ukrainian nation, language, and literature. He brought Ukrainians a sense of themselves, their culture, traditions, mentality, a new Ukrainian literature. Gogol is ours. Gogol is Ukrainian, and his works are a powerful spiritual force that is concentrated, a huge vital energy that will work in tandem with Ukraine forever. There is no better way to end this than with a quote from Gogol himself, writing about Ukraine in his story called May Night or the Drowned Maiden. Do you know a Ukrainian night? No, you do not know a night in Ukraine. Take a closer look at her. The moon shines in the midst of the sky. The immeasurable vault of heaven seems to have expanded to infinity. The earth is bathed in silver light. The air is warm, voluptuous, and redolent of innumerable sweet scents. Divine night, magical night. Motionless but inspired with divine breath, the forest stands casting enormous shadows and wrapped in complete darkness. Calmly and placidly sleep the lakes surrounded by the green thickets. The virginal groves of the hawthorns and cherry trees stretch their roots timidly into the cool water. Only now and then their leaves rustle unwillingly when the night wind sneaks up to kiss them. The whole landscape is hushed in slumber, but there is a mysterious breath upon the heights. One falls into a weird and unearthly mood, and slippery apparitions rise from the depth. Divine night, magical night. Suddenly, the woods, lakes, and steppes become alive. The nightingales of Ukraine are singing, and it seems as though the moon itself were listening to their song. The village sleeps as though under a magic spell. The cottages shine in the moonlight against the darkness of the woods behind them. The songs grow silent, and all is still. Thank you so much for joining me today, and this was what we need to know about Ukraine this week.